All right. All right, guys. Welcome. Thank you for jumping in into part three of implementing Ethernet virtual LANs. We had a great discussion last time. We were talking about trunking. Um, we started talking about trunking. We started talking about some of the verification commands you can do to go ahead and verify that a VLAN was created. Um, and of course, we talked about the concept of VLAN tagging, right? And how that only relates to 802.1q. Okay. Gary had an amazing question that we went down a rabbit hole, and that's what we do, right? Nerds get together and start going down rabbit holes, right? So never be afraid to go down a rabbit hole about something because it can actually help you in the future. So we left off, if you're following in the book, the part where we're going to learn about the configuration of VLAN trunking, right? So, but let's review back of what is it, right? The configuration of trunking in general is just, as it relates to the Cisco exam, is just configuring a link between switches, identified as a trunk between two Cisco switches, right? Um, by software, right? Simply by software. Okay. So typically we would go into software, we would add a interface subcommand, right? We would say, hey, this interface make the link that I'm configuring now a trunk, right? We would use the command switch port mode trunk, right? We would create a VLAN, right? And we would identify the native and so on, right? So we can have communication between the trunk and it can tag the proper frames that are passing through that trunk at a from a layer two perspective, right? But the thing about trunking, right? There's different options on how to configure it, right? If you guys see my screen, right? As the book states, however, trunking configuration on Cisco switches includes many more options, including several options for dynamically negotiating various trunking settings. The configuration can either predefine different settings or tell the switch to negotiate the settings. Okay, right? So you can set this up manually or you can set this up dynamically. Okay, and you guys heard this before. You guys heard this whenever we're talking about configuring IP addresses, right? You guys heard this whenever we were speaking about we were briefly speaking about VLAN, we were briefly speaking about spanning tree, what have you, in earlier sessions or what have you. Okay. So the types of trunking, right? We have the IEEE 802.1q, right? That's one type of trunking. And we have ISL, inter switch link, right? Created by Cisco. Or negotiate which one to use on switches that support both types of trunking, right? Okay. Now the what you would do have has the administrative is you would decide for a design standpoint which mode you would want to do, right? And it states here right on the slide is that, of course, whether to always trunk, okay, to always be a trunk, to always not trunk, or negotiate whether to be a trunk or not, okay? So the first type, right? First type of trunking, like I told you guys, legacy was ISL, right? That was done by Cisco or what have you, and of course then come in to IEEE 802.1q, right? And if you go on actually older code, and actually in my even G lab, right? If you guys seen it before, whenever I'm configuring a trunk, you'll see it has the old command that says switch port trunk encapsulation. And it'll give me three options. It'll say .1q, it'll say ISL, or it'll say negotiate, has a subcommand, right? And the negotiate is where we are speaking about DTP, dynamic trunking protocol. And this is where it's negotiating the type of trunking to use, right? Whether it's going to prefer to use ISL, right? Cisco proprietary, or it's going to use IEEE.1q or what have you. Okay. Whichever one is supported, right? So the thing with DTP, right? And we'll keep it simple, right? They can also negotiate if both of the devices, right? Because the trunk could only exist between two devices, right? And I want you guys to remember that because that's very important, right? A trunk can only exist between two peers, right? DTP can also negotiate whether it's good to create a trunk, right? A link at all or not. Okay. All right. So the administrative mode, right? And we'll dive deep into that in a bit, right? The administrative mode refers to the configuration setting for whether trunking should be used. Okay. What do I mean by that? So if we use the command, right? If we get into interface configuration mode, if we use the subcommand switch port mode X, right? We're defining the trunking mode as listed in this table, right? So I can say, I just saw your comment, Yasin. I got you, I got you. So I can say, right, if I'm setting up the administrative mode, I can say, hey, either switch port mode access, always access a non-trunk. So never become a trunk, right? This is the first administrative option that you can go ahead and configure, right? Or switch port mode trunk, always be a trunk, okay? Whenever you put that command in as a subcommand, switch port mode trunk, you are telling that link, that interface or interfaces to always be a trunk. Let's move down to DTP, right? Dynamic desirable, right? Initiates negotiation messages and responds to negotiation messages to dynamically choose whether to start using trunking. Let's look back at that, at the description, because that's kind of quick, right? Dynamic desirable. Key word here is desirable. I want you guys to remember that for the exam because this is a key topic. In regards to dynamic trunking and using the key term desirable, what this does, it initiates negotiation messages and responds to negotiation messages to dynamically choose whether to start using trunking. So what you're telling the switch is to desire a connection. Okay. Right. So what it's doing is going to start communication and it's also going to be listening for communication, right? For DTP messages, right? To set up trunks dynamically. Okay. That's if you use the command, right? Desirable, right? As far as administrative mode. Now we go to dynamic auto. Okay. Dynamic auto passively waits to receive trunk negotiation messages, at which point the switch will respond and negotiate whether to use trunking. Okay. So if you use the keyword auto, the switch is not going to initiate trunk negotiation messages. It's always going to be in a listening state. Okay. All right. So understand the difference. Okay. Desirable, it is initiating and listening. Auto is just listening. And this is regarding trunking administrative mode options. Okay. Whenever you're using the switch port mode command. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at some examples so it can make a little bit more sense. Okay. This is going to be a short session just because this is a lot of information. I don't want to overload you guys. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at figure 8-10, right? So we have our diagram here. We have a switch and we have two switches, right? And Gary, I think you've seen this before. We have three VLANs, right? But between these two switches, right, we are trunking, right? These three VLANs, as you guys can see, identified by the different colors. Okay, so let's talk about this, right? So let's remember our interfaces. Our interfaces from switch one is gigabit 1/0. That's our trunk port. And from switch two, gigabit 0/2. All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at some configuration, right? So we can take a look at example 8-5 and we can see, right? Where the administrative mode is configured, right? We run the show interfaces gigabit 0/1 switch port command, right? And we can see right here, right? We can see that the administrative mode is dynamic auto. This is where you can confirm what administrative mode your interface is running. Okay. All right. So dynamic auto, right? And of course, the operational mode is static, right? The administrative trunking encapsulation, right? So this is also, right, is what is negotiated over that trunk using DTP messages. .1Q, right? Okay. All right. Optional trunking encapsulation, right? It's native, right? And of course, voice VLAN, and we'll talk about that soon, is set to none. Okay. There's more information that you guys can see here that is vital, right? In regards to design, in regards to setting up your trunk. But a lot of this that is not highlighted is outside the scope of the exam. So you guys don't need to worry about this for now. But we'll touch on it a little bit more later. There is a second part of this screenshot. Let's go ahead and go to it. I think it's very important. So right here, this is where great information is shared, right? It's going to tell you in that command, right, in that verification command, about the VLANs that you're trunking, right? So if you ever want to check and see, right, if you don't want to use the show interface trunk command, or you would just want to use this, right, to check if an interface that is a trunk that you know is a part of a trunk, what is doing for the VLANs, right? You can check here and see, hey, trunking VLANs enabled. It's going to say all, and it's going to tell you that it's trunking all the VLANs. Okay. All right. So, and of course, like I shared with you guys, one way to verify, right, your trunk, you can do a show interface trunk. And of course, there's no output here, but it would show you your configuration and your outputs for your trunk. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and go back because I just want to go ahead and go over what we got highlighted, right? Um, Even though I did go over it, but I just want to go ahead and touch on a few key points, notes that I have here from the book, right? Um, so we're looking at here, right? And we're on switch one, right? So we see the output and we see the settings set to dynamic auto, right? Um, and we see, of course, that switch two also defaults to dynamic auto, right? The command list switch one's operational state has access. Let me make sure I mark that again. Okay, right? So I'm going to say that again, right? This book implies, right? So we're on switch one, because switch two for this scenario defaults to dynamic auto, the command list switch one's operational state has access, meaning that it is not trunking. Okay, so it is not a trunk yet. Okay. Side note, dynamic auto, whenever you see that, tells both switches to sit there and wait on the other switch to start the negotiation, right? So if we have both switches, right? Sorry for my terrible drawings, right? Both switches set to auto, right? Both of them are just sitting there waiting to see, hey, who's going to start the negotiations, right? So I hope that makes sense as to why the operational mode is static, right? It's static access because, of course, nobody's begun the negotiations yet. Okay. All right. But we can see that it's enabled in this course, it's waiting, right? Okay. Let's go ahead and move on. So we see right here, and let's talk about this, the administrative, oops, let me erase that. The administrative trunking encapsulation, right? Like I shared with you guys before, you can see that this, this only supports 802.1q. Okay. Again, typically Cisco switches, they support both ISL and 802.1q, right? And of course, if you saw, right, if the command prior to was set to negotiate, of course it would negotiate which one it would use, right? And of course you would see the code name negotiate next to the end of this, right? But 802.1q was manually configured. Okay. Let's talk about the operational trunking encapsulation, right? Being set to native, right? Basically what this does is just is referencing that 802.1q is set up has natively to use that protocol. Okay. Now, you guys are probably thinking, well, ISO was created by Cisco. Yes, yes, it was, right? But now that now that the book is referencing Cisco 9Ks, right? Now where they're basing a lot of their configurations out of the IEEE standard 802.1q, right? So whenever you see operational trunk encapsulation and it says native, it is just referencing that, hey, I am following the RFC, right? And the standards to where us using 802.1q, I am also using a native VLAN. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and clear this out. And again, this is what's just looking what it looks like in a state of whenever using DTP, and both switches are using dynamic auto. Okay. Right. So what happens, right? How can we fix this setup, right, between switch one and switch two? Right? One switch would have to be negotiating, right? So what the book does here, it shows us that, hey, let's go ahead and fix this by going into global configuration mode. Let's enter the subcommand, right, to change the administrative mode, okay, of the interface. And we're going to say switch port mode dynamic desirable. And guys, again, remember, right, in shorthand, to paraphrase, dynamic desirable initiates and also listens for dynamic trunking protocol messages, right, between other switches. Okay. So now that you went ahead and configured that, as you guys can see, right, you guys can see that we now had a couple of syslog messages. And we see the syslog messages that show, hey, the state of layer one, right? We'll keep it simple. Layer one has changed for gigabit 0/1, and layer two has changed for gigabit Ethernet 0/1, right? So now if we go ahead and do a show interface gigabit 0/1 switch port, right? So we can see all the statuses of the interface. We can see a few things that are different. We see the administrative mode, right? What we configure, desirable. It's initiating and listening to DTP messages. We confirm that. But the operational mode changed. Now that we are not just passively listening to DTP messages, now since it can initiate and communicate with other switches, that means it can start the negotiation of creating a trunk. And once it does that, it'll go ahead and create that trunk to keep it simple. And so now we can see in its operational mode, hey, it is now a trunk. Okay. So whenever you're configuring a trunk, right, and you want to go ahead and check, okay, I'm using DTP instead of statically just setting it up as a trunk. How can I check to make sure that it's working? Right? How can I make sure that at least one side is initiating and listening, or spoiler alert, both sides are initiating and listening for DTP messages on this link, right? We can go ahead and check here. We can check it, do the show interface gigabit 0/1 switch port. We can see dynamic desirable. And of course, we can see the operational mode, right? Okay. And a couple of things changed here, right? Right. The third highlighted line, of course, it's still .1q, but we can see operational trunking encapsulation. is also using .1Q. It's specifically identified as using .1Q. Okay. Let me show you guys a bit of a graphic. Let me go ahead and close this because I want it to make sense and I want you guys to take a screenshot of this. Um, and this is gonna help you for the exam. So please take a screenshot, save it for your notes. Um, you will be tested, and even though I took the exam during the ICND days, this table, I remember this table vividly. It actually helped me. So you have to know the different combinations, right? So let's talk about it. So we spoke about administrative modes, right? Access, dynamic auto, trunk, dynamic desirable, right? But what's the outcome whenever we configure it with something on the other side, right? So, right, it's like a X chart, right? So these are the different administrative modes, and the different columns are telling us, hey, what's going to be the outcome if you configure the switch, if the switch on the other side is configured as such. Okay, so if we take a look at this, right, we see if we set this up as an access, right? Let's say, hey, that link is just an access, switch port mode access, right? If the other side is set up has an access, right? What's the result? It's just going to be an access link. It is just going to be an access link. Okay. What about one side is set up as access and another side is set up as dynamic auto? Guess what? Right? Auto is just listening to dynamic trunking protocol messages. It's not initiating. So its default configuration is going to be, hey, I'm just going to be an access port until I hear something, right? I hear from another switch, DTP initiating messages, right? So that link is going to be a what? Access port. If on one side you set up as access link, and of course the other side is a trunk, just not going to set up, dude. And of course the book tells you do not use. Okay. And of course you see this little star that's next to it. When two switches configure a mode of access on one end and trunk on the other, problems will occur. Okay. Avoid this configuration. Okay. And last but not least, I'm sure you guys are seeing the pattern. One side says access, another side says dynamic desirable. Guess what? The link will default to being an access. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and jump on ahead, right? Dynamic auto, right? That mode. If our other switch is set up as access, that link will be an access port. If, of course, we have one side being a dynamic auto and another side being dynamic auto, as you guys saw with switch one and switch two, for the example, that link will always just stay an access port. It will not be a trunk. If one side, right, and this is interesting, if one side is set as dynamic auto and another side has set up as statically a trunk, it will become a trunk. Okay. If one side is set up as dynamic auto and another side set up as dynamic desirable, it will become a trunk. Okay. Yasin, good question. Remind me to answer that question once we go ahead and we get to the end. Okay. We're almost done here. We're almost at the top of the hour. And when I say top of the hour, I mean the 30-minute mark that I'm trying to keep. Um, administrative mode, if we set up one side as a trunk, of course, you're going to see as well, it's going to say do not use. We're going to have errors if the other side is set up as access. If the other side is set up as dynamic auto, it's going to configure as a trunk. The other side is set up as a trunk, is going to configure as a trunk. If the other side is set as dynamic desirable, it is going to set up as a trunk. Last but not least, the administrative mode is set up as a trunk, right? I mean, set up as dynamic desirable, and the other side is set up as access. It will become access, okay? Because again, even though dynamic desirable is the most dominant, right, mode that we want to set up, if it doesn't, you got to think about the other part of the role of the dynamic desirable switch, right? We'll call it that, right? If it's even though it's initiating, but if there's nobody listening, right, it can't start negotiation, right? So it's going to default as, hey, I'm just going to stay as an access port because there's nobody else that wants to become a trunk. Okay. All right. And of course, as with the static trunk, it will always become a trunk if we're using dynamic auto, trunk, or dynamic desirable. Okay. I want you guys to drill that in your head. Lab it up. You can get on Packet Tracer and test that out. Okay. Now, um, just recommendation, and Cisco rarely does recommendations, right? Because the software is free reign, you can do what you want, right? It's your design. Cisco recommends whenever you're configuring the trunk to disable um, trunk negotiation on ports from a security standpoint. Okay, as you guys know, in this world of a lot of bad actors and cybersecurity attacks, um, it is possible, right, for bad actors to emulate DTP messages. Okay. Um, you can check your configuration sometimes, and sometimes if you do these show interfaces, gigabit 0/1 switch port, um, sometimes they're administrative mode, right? Even though you may not know it, it may be set to dynamic auto. You might be listening for DTP messages. Um, you want to make sure that, like I was telling you guys earlier in this chapter, before you put it in production, just go on the interface, default all the interfaces, put in the commands switch port mode access, okay? And make sure that it's just in there. And your verification is you're not going to see, depending on the switch, you're not going to see switch port mode access whenever you run the show run. But it's just for good measure, it is always good to make sure that you put switch port mode access, and or if you want to statically set up a trunk, switch port mode trunk. Okay. Um, Now, if we set up switch port mode trunk, right? And I think this is the thing that I have to fill in for you. Whenever switch port mode trunk, whenever that command is used, yes, DTP is still operating, right? But what you can do is once you put in the command, switch port mode trunk, because of course that static command is still responding to DTP messages. After that command, you can put in switch port no negotiate. And what will happen is, even though it's set up as a trunk, just like you guys seen within this table, right? These configurations won't work, right? Because now you're telling that switch port to not listen to negotiation messages in regards to dynamic trunking. Okay. All right. I know we hit the top. We went little bit over, but I wanted to make sure that it made the point, right? So we will go into a part 4, maybe a part 5, part 6, but I'm taking my time on layer 2 because this is such a precursor, such a good precursor for layer 3. Okay. Um, Let me go ahead and open the floor for any questions. Yasin, I know you had questions. Let me go ahead and go back. Um, okay, and Yasin, you can go ahead and unmute. So you stated, what's the benefit of having the switches do this dynamically? I guess why would this need to be something automatically done in
Yeah.
cases, in what cases would these VLANs through trunking change? I don't know if my questions make sense. Your questions absolutely does make sense, right? So let's talk about it, right? What's the benefit of having switches do this dynamically, right? So let's say you have a enterprise campus, right? Um, Hundreds, right? Not even hundreds. Let's say more than 20 switches in production that you have to manage. And let's say that you have to do a switch refresh, meaning that you have to replace the current switches in production with newer switches due to end of life, end of support, so on and so on. Okay. Um, that's going to be a lot of switches that you need to go ahead and configure, right? And to make sure that, hey, your configured has a trunk, your configured has a trunk, your configured has a trunk. right? Um, it's always good to go ahead and set up, right? If you're doing this, right? Set up and make sure, hey, the enterprise came up, right? And it came up a little bit faster, right? Because I went ahead and set up my interlinks between different switches to dynamically become a trunk, right? It leaves out a lot of overhead of trying to um, manually go into each switch and configure it as a trunk. In regards to maintenance after, right, putting it in production, if something goes down, right, maybe a link goes down or what have you, you're having some interface errors and or um maybe error disabled on the port. As soon as it comes up, it'll automatically start negotiating and become a trunk again. Okay. So it's a little bit easier, right? It's a little bit easier to go ahead and manage that port. Um, and of course, it also works well with VLAN trunking protocol, VTP. Um, Side note, that is VTP is not on the exam, but we will be going over that. I think it's a cool protocol. You can use that for pre-staging, right? Pre-staging switches and what have you, just to propagate VLANs on different switches so that you don't have to go to different switches. Um, but of course, now we have automation, right? Python and what have you, but we'll talk about that in a future session. The second part, um, hopefully I answered the second part of your question as well. Um, your third part of your question is you stated that in what cases would these VLANs through trunking change? That is an amazing question. So VLANs, right? VLANs can change based on whoever configures a VLAN. Simple as that, right? But it's very peculiar on whenever you're creating a VLAN on a switch that's already in production. Okay. Um, you may have I've seen configurations of trunk ports to where, and you guys haven't seen it yet, where you could exclusively tell the trunk what VLANs to allow on that trunk. You understand? If you have that in production, and there's probably a design reason as to why you did that. If you do that and you create a new VLAN, right? That VLAN is not exclusively enabled on trunks per your design. If we're using the command switch port trunk VLAN allowed or VLAN remove. We'll say VLAN allowed. VLAN allowed, and you exclusively specify which VLANs to allow on the trunk. Everything else, right, gets dropped or denied, right? Meaning that if, let's say, we allow VLANs 1, 2, and 3 on the trunk using that command, but we also have VLANs 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on the switch. What does that mean? That means only on this trunk, VLANs 1 through 3 is allowed. And just for this scenario, let's say that's what we configured when we first put the switch in production. Over time, right, the business needs change. If we went ahead and add new VLANs and we forgot as an administrator to configure to exclusively allow these different VLANs to be on the trunk, we are going to have communication issues, right? And we may be in a world of troubleshooting loops, right? If we don't understand what trunking is, how trunking works, how these configuration works, okay, to enable communication, right, from a layer 2 standpoint, not a layer 3. Okay, I've been in circles to where I've did the loop de loop of trying to figure out why communication wasn't happening, even though we've seen layer 3 instances, right? Be existing, meaning we have IP addresses, what have you. It's all because of layer 2. This is why, to step on my podium a little bit, this is why I'm telling you guys, before you jump into anything layer 3, and we will have our fun, trust me, we will have our fun in layer 3 and talking about OSPF, IPv4 routing, IPv6 routing. We will have our fun, but we need our fundamentals before we jump in. Okay? Does that make sense, Yasin?
When I posted on LinkedIn recently, you had mentioned that you want me to do more layer two
Hmm.
things. I guess from that perspective, it makes a lot more sense now.
Cool, cool, cool. Good stuff. All right. Any other questions, guys? Blow me up. Feel free to ask me.
No question from me for today's session.
Okay. Okay. Mike, Kivia, Don, you guys good? All right.
Yeah, I'm good. No
Okay.
Oh,
questions for me.
good.
Cool.
Could I don't know what your availability looks like, but could I pick your brain on some of these topics after this session?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah,
cool.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Just ping me and then we'll agree on the time and then we can go ahead and jump in. I know Gary has to pick my brain. So yeah, just let me know.
Yes, Dave, I've been working on it. I have somewhat of the lab you told me to
Okay.
do it.
Okay.
Um, I went ahead actually created a document for myself, one
Nice.
OneNote.
Nice.
Um, went
Nice.
through. I went through a little bit more. I'm
Okay.
sorry for that. I
Oh,
went through
oh,
the
oh, listen,
trunking.
listen. Do not apologize for chasing knowledge. Please don't ever apologize to me about that. So that's I love that you did that. So that's good.
Mhm. I can certainly like maybe have a session where I can explain
Hmm.
VLANs and trunking.
Okay.
And I will start from the LANs, like a local area network, all the
Hmm.
way through the broadcast domain, and then how it becomes the VLAN, and then how it becomes the trunk,
Hmm.
all of that. Um, and then whenever you're ready, and you can help me out actually with corrections and stuff.
Hmm.
I'm trying to do this, as I said the earlier, for a couple of new guys we are hiring. I want to
Okay.
make sure they understand the VLANs the way that I understood, or it's basically they will be working on layer two primarily.
Okay.
And yeah,
Okay. Okay. Cool. So just let me know. Just like I told Yasin, I mean, whenever you want me to take a look at it, we'll negotiate and think about a time, and then we can go from there.
yeah,
All right, guys. Well, you guys have a great Sunday. Okay.
you too.
All right,
You
guys.